So just to kind of get into this, I don't have a specific text tonight, but I'm going to be bouncing around between a couple different books and chapters. However, I'm going to start out in Genesis 15. I'm going to read verses 1 through 16. If you want to turn there, you can. We can read it together. If not, then I can just flow through it real quick. It says, "After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision and said, 'Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield and your very great reward.' But Abram said, 'Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus?' And Abram said, 'You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir.' Then the word of the Lord came to him and said, 'This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir.' He took him outside and said, 'Look up at the sky and count the stars. If indeed you can count them.' Then the Lord said to him, 'So shall your offspring be.' Abram believed the Lord, and he credited him as righteousness. He also said to him, 'I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it.' But Abram said, 'Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it?' So the Lord said to him, 'Bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon.' Abram brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged them arranged the halves opposite of each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. Then the birds of prey came down to the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, 'Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation that they serve as slaves, and afterwards they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation your descendants will come back here, for the sins of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure.'" I've got a title. It's Trouble in Paradise. So just to kind of start off, I had like 20 pages of notes on this, and it's really hard to condense this down to like 45 minutes to speak on. So I'm going to try to get through this the best I can. I'm going to have to do some grinding to kind of set up the structure of this, but we'll get there. Just hang with me. So within the narrative of Genesis 15, we have this conversation between Abram and the Lord. Abram, an elderly gentleman, believed to be about 75 years old, is questioning God about his lineage. God approaches Abram and says, "Hey, Abram, I just want you to know that it's me, God. I'm your shield and your great reward." Abram replies back saying, "Great reward? What do I really have since I don't have any heirs or any children? I don't have an heir to give my estate to. I've got this random guy who's my servant and nothing else." This troubled Abram, and God knew it. And God proceeds to tell Abram that his seed will be as there are stars in the sky. Have you ever tried to count how many stars in the sky? How many constellations and solar systems there are? Abram believed God, but notice how God reminded Abram that what he did for him so far. God says, "I have brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land and to take possession of it." Abram, still questioning God, asks how he can know that this is his land, the land that God is talking about. God said to bring him a heifer, a goat, and a ram, all 3 years old. They had to be young, along with the dove and a young pigeon. Cut them in two and arrange them in halves opposite of each other. But Abram did not follow through with the assignment. He did not cut the birds in half, and that's a major thing. As the sun was, let me skip back as I got ahead. Other birds of prey started to fly around the carcasses, and Abram drove them away. And as the sun was setting, he fell into a deep sleep, and a thick darkness came over him. And the Lord visited him again and said, "Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will become strangers in a country they don't know, and they will be slaved and mistreated. And I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterwards they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will die at an old age, and in the 4th generation your descendants will come back here." Notice the word here at the end of verse 16. The word here is speaking to the promised land. This was the land promised to this Semitic group by God. Semitic is the pre-Israelite culture. But because Abram didn't do fully what God said, his descendants would for 400 years reap what Abram did not do in captivity in Egypt. The connection between Moses and Abraham is biological. Abraham had many sons. Father Abraham has many sons. You know the song. Don't make me do it. One of those sons' name was Isaac. Isaac then had a son named Jacob, then had a son named Levi. Levi had a son named Amram, and Amram had a son named Moses. So we see the genealogy as where Moses was the great-great-great-grandson of Abraham. According to tradition, Moses' parents, Amram and Jochebed, hid Moses for 3 months and set him afloat on the Nile in a reed basket daubed with pitch. Pitch is a material that was used to bind the reed that was used to make the basket. Moses was found by the Pharaoh's daughter while bathing. So Moses grew up in the household of the Pharaohs. He lived like an Egyptian prince, had the servants, and was brought up learning the ways that Egyptian royalty would have known. As Moses got older, it is evident from his accomplishments that he had instruction in religious, civil, and military matters. Normally, the princes would know that kind of stuff. Egypt had control of Canaan, which is now Palestine, a part of Syria, and had contacts with other nations of the Fertile Crescent. Moses undoubtedly had a general knowledge of life in the ancient Near East. Remember in Genesis 15 and 16b, it says, the sins of the Amorites have not reached its full measure. The Amorites were a part of the ancient Semitic-speaking people who dominated the history of Mesopotamia, Syria, and Palestine, or Canaan, from about 2000 to about 1600 BC. During Moses' education, he somehow learned that he was a Hebrew, and his sense of concern and curiosity impelled him to visit his people. Moses was about 25 years old when he took the inspection tour among his people as slaves. There he saw the oppressive measures under which they labored. When he found an Egyptian taskmaster beating a Hebrew to death, he couldn't control his sense of judgment. After checking to make sure that nobody was in sight, he killed the Egyptian taskmaster. As a prince in the court, Moses was probably in excellent physical condition and knew the latest methods of combat. The flush of victory pulled Moses back the next day. He had removed one threat of his people and was determined to render aid again. This time he found 2 Hebrews fighting. After separating them, he questioned the offender in an attempt to mediate the disagreement. 2 questions jolted him. Number 1, who made you prince and judge over us? Question number 2, do you intend to kill me as you intended to kill the Egyptian? The confidence of the self-appointed deliverer turned into fear. One of his own knew his secret, and soon Pharaoh would too. Realizing that he would have had to flee, he went to Midian. Ramses II became king as a late teenager and reigned for 67 years. He claimed to be a divine pharaoh, as all pharaohs did. His ego expressed itself in massive building operations throughout Egypt, throughout his whole reign, and before his reign ended, his boast of accomplishments and success literally filled acres of wall space. It was probably a few years after the Battle of Kadesh in 1275 BC that Moses and Aaron confronted Ramses with their demand. Exodus 5:1-2 says, Then the Lord said to Moses, Go to Pharaoh and say to him, This is what the Lord says, to let my people go, so that they may worship me. If you refuse to let them go, I will send plagues upon your people. We see later in this passage that as a God in human form, little g, Ramses was not accustomed to taking orders from lesser gods, let alone Yahweh. He asked Moses, Who is this Lord that you're talking about? Should I heed his voice and let Israel go? I don't know the Lord, and I definitely won't let Israel go. This began setting the stage of a long struggle between a distrustful ruler with an outsized ego and a prophet with a new understanding of who Yahweh was and his power. According to Britannica's account of the Exodus, the article reads as follows. Scholars differ wildly concerning the narrative about the plagues. Some claim that 3 sources have been combined, but more recent scholarship finds only 2 traditions. While granting that some of the plagues had a core of historicity, other critics tend to discount the present accounts as fantastic stories with pious decorations. A recent school of research suggests that notwithstanding some later additions, all of the plagues probably had a historical core. The basic cause, according to one of the interpretations, was usually high flooding of the Nile. The White Nile originates in the lake region of East Central Africa, known today as Uganda. The flow is fairly even through the year because of consistent equatorial rains. The Blue Nile, on the other hand, originates in the headwaters of the Ethiopian highlands, and it varies from a small stream to a raging torrent. At the time Moses was bargaining with Ramses, excessively heavy summer rains in Ethiopia washed powdery, carmine red soil from the slopes of the hills. Around the Lake Tana region, the blood-red torrent picked up bright red algae and their bacteria. Since there were no dams at the time, the Nile flooded blood red all the way to the Mediterranean. It probably reached the Delta region in August. Thus, this rare natural event, it is held, set in motion a series of conditions that continued until March. Pharaoh's unmoving stance is what set in motion this challenge to show which god is more powerful. The Egyptians, like other pagan cultures, worship a wide variety of nature gods that contributed their powers to the natural phenomena based on the world around them. There was a god of the river, god of childbirth, sun, crops, the Nile, whatever. The annual flooding of the Nile, which fertilized their croplands for them, was evidence that their god's power and goodwill. While studying for this message and studying the plagues, I found it quite fascinating how God didn't intend just to come after Pharaoh, but to cut off the life support of Egypt as a whole. And here's why. I'm going to go through the 10 plagues just very quickly, but there's certain parts of this I just want you all to really grasp a hold of. Number 1, the water turned into blood. Exodus 7:17 through 18. It says, "This was a judgment against Apis, the god of the Nile, Isis, the goddess of the Nile, and Kanu, guardian of the Nile. The Nile was believed to be the bloodstream of Osiris, who was reborn each year when the river flooded. The Nile was the basis of daily life and helped form the economy, and later devastated because millions of fish died in the water and the water was unusable." Number 2, the plague of the frogs. Exodus 8:1 through 4. This was a judgment against Heket, the frog-headed goddess of birth. Frogs were thought to be sacred and not to be killed. I hate frogs. Keep them away. That's of the devil. I don't want none of it. That's right. God had all the frogs from the Nile invade each and every home, and when they died, their stinking bodies were heaped up in offensive piles throughout the land. Number 3, plague of the gnats. Exodus 8:16 through 17. This was judgment on Set, god of the desert. This is what intrigued me. Magicians of the court were unable to duplicate this one and told Pharaoh. He said, "This is the finger of God." And that is recorded in Exodus 8:19. Number 4, plague of the flies. Exodus 8:20 through 22. This was judgment on Uagen, the fly god. In this plague, God clearly distinguished the difference between the Israelites and the Egyptians. The flies didn't swarm around any areas that the Israelites lived. And there will be other times where the same exact thing kind of happened. Number 5, plague of the livestock. Exodus 9:1 through 4. Judgment on the goddess Hathor and the god Apis, both depicted as cattle in Egyptian petroglyphs. As with plague 4, with the flies, God also distinguished the difference between the Israelites and the Egyptians. The livestock of the Israelites were not touched. But I want you to notice that God was steadily declining the economy of Egypt while showing his ability to protect and provide for those who obeyed him. Exodus 9:7 says Pharaoh sent investigators to see if the Israelites were suffering from the Egyptians. But when they realized the Israelites were living well, Pharaoh's heart hardened towards the Israelites. Number 6, plague of boils. Exodus 9:8-9. Judgment against several gods over health and disease. Sekhmet, Sunu, and Pisces. The Bible says that the magicians could not stand before Moses because of their boils. The religious leaders of Egypt were starting to see that they were powerless against the God of the Israelites. Before God sent the last 3 plagues, Pharaoh was given a special message from God, meant to show Pharaoh that God was the only true God. Exodus 9:13-14 says that, "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Get up early in the morning, confront Pharaoh, and say to him, This is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says. Let my people go, so that they may worship me. Or this time I will send the full force of the plagues against you and against your officials and your people, so that you may know that there is none like me in all the earth.' As an example of God's grace, Moses told Pharaoh to grab all of the cattle, the crops, whatever left was living as far as goods go. He said, remaining from the previous 6 plagues, and shelter them from the coming storm. Some of the Egyptians heeded the warning, and others did not." Number 7, plague of hail. Exodus 9:22-23. This was judgment against the sky goddess Nut, Osiris, the crop fertility god, and Set, the storm god. This hail was never seen before. It was accompanied by fire that fell on the ground. Everything left out in the open was completely ruined, and by the hail and the fire. But yet the children of Israel were still protected. Before the next plague, God tells Moses that the Israelites would be able to tell their children of the things they had seen God do in Egypt and how it showed them God's power. Number 8, plague of locust. Exodus 10:4-5. Again focused on Nut, Osiris, and Set. The later crops, wheat and rye, that survived the hail were consumed by the locust. Now, you need some wheat and rye. We've got some down here at some of the distilleries you can borrow. We don't need none of that here. This means that there would be no harvest in Egypt that year. That's a major thing because this is their life that they're talking about. Number 9, plagues of darkness. Exodus 10:21-22. This was aimed judgment at the sun god Ra. And in Egyptian petroglyphs, this is normally symbolized by Pharaoh himself. For 3 days, Egypt was smothered by unearthly darkness. While the Israelites did not have to suffer darkness, there was enough area, I think it was maybe 5 miles difference between where the Israelites, where they were housed at, the servant camps, versus where they were actually working. Have you ever seen where the rain will rain on one side of the street and not the other? That's kind of how this darkness fell. Plague of death of the firstborn, plague number 10, Exodus 11:4-7. This was judgment on Isis, protector of children. I go through all that to say this. God was teaching the Israelites a deep spiritual lesson that pointed to Christ. Unlike the other plagues, this last plague required an act of faith by them. The Israelites only survived by virtue of their identity as God's chosen people. God commanded each family to take an unblemished male lamb, slaughter it, smear the blood on top of the sides of the doorpost with hyssop, and then the lamb was to be roasted and eaten later that night. Now, I took a trip to Israel in 2019, and I didn't get a picture of it, but I loved the trip to Israel. And one of the things that our tour guide did, he was an intellectual archaeologist, published. He took us to the Temple Mount to tour it one day. We step outside the Dung Gate, which is the southernmost gate, and he's like, guys, you got to try this. This vendor over here across the street from the Dung Gate on the City of David side, he was selling bagels. But these bagels were like this round, like they were this long and wide, and you had to dip them in hyssop. Hated it. This hyssop was nasty. It tasted like dirt and oregano. Like, it was just disgusting. And I don't mean any disrespect to Israel. I just ate the bread. I called it a day and just ate the bread. But God described how he would send the destroyer through the land and would kill the firstborn of every household who didn't put up the lamb's blood in the doorpost. While the Israelites took heed to the instruction of the lamb's blood, found God's protection in their homes. The other homes in the land, Egyptian and Hebrew both, experienced God's wrath as their firstborn child died. This is the event that led Pharaoh to free the Israelites. By the time Israelites left Egypt, but not yet at the Red Sea, they had a clear picture of God's power, protection, and plan for them. For those who were willing to believe, they had convincing evidence they served the true and living God. Sadly, many still failed to believe, which led to other trials and lessons by God. See, the thing about it is, Israel questioned the method of God. Why? Because when they go down out of Egypt and they come to the Red Sea, they get to the Red Sea and they see, Moses, you brought us to the Red Sea to kill us. What are they doing? They're complaining against the method of God. Why are they complaining against the method of God? Because the Red Sea was not there to kill Moses and the Israelites. It was to cut off and set up to kill Pharaoh and Egypt. I don't think you're grasping what I'm saying. I've struggled with this for 2 days, and I've just about took off shouting when I wrote this. We've been cursing our Red Seas, thinking that God is setting us up for destruction. God did not bring Israel to the Red Sea to drown Israel in the Red Sea. God brought Israel to the Red Sea knowing that in his sovereign mind, that he had the power to breathe on it and split it from east to west, Israel walking over it through dry ground, and Pharaoh thought in his demented mind that I'll chase them and take them over. But God said, I got you, big boy. That's when the rat chased the bait, the trap snapped on the rat, and Pharaoh's army was swallowed up by the Red Sea. I'm sorry, I'm a spitting Baptist today. Stop worrying about the water. It's not for you. It's for your enemy. God, I can run through hell with a water gun right now, I swear. Might as well just introduce you to Pharaoh himself. Let me introduce you to Pharaoh Ramses II. This is Pharaoh Ramses II. This was the same Pharaoh that Moses went up against. Nobody likes a delay in the journey. I personally don't like to stop when I'm heading to Nashville for a day trip or Florida for a week and I have a layover in an airport. Whenever we come to a road under construction or traffic that halts our journey for hours, we feel tempted to throw up our hands and say, what now? What's going on? Enter the Israelites who had endured hundreds of years of slavery in Egypt. Coming out of bondage and walking along the dry ground of the parted Red Sea, they must have thought they'd arrive at the land of their dreams in no time. But sure enough, they hit snags along the way. They in turn looked at the idols and the gods that they once worshipped and grew accustomed to in Egypt to speed along the process. When they reached the promised land, they sent spies out to scout the area. When the spies reported back, they had realized that the fortified city and its people were intimidating. Caleb and Joshua, two of the spies, tried to tell the Israelites not to go. But because of their disobedience and forgetfulness of God's promise, God delayed their entry into the promised land by 40 years. Aside from Caleb and Joshua, has anyone over a certain age would not see the promised land, since their generation did not exercise enough strong faith in God's provision. In the desert, the Israelites had to run on low provisions. And it gets to the point where the Israelites turn back to the good old days of their slavery in Egypt, where they didn't have to worry about starvation. They get so hungry in the desert, they think hundreds of years in Egypt sounded like paradise. God, seeing their need for food, still provided them with manna and quail from heaven daily until they entered the promised land. God understood the desert was just a temporary setback for the Israelites. But the Israelites didn't understand that. They complained to God to the point where they rebuilt the idols and worshiped them instead of God. How many times are we going to be put in the desert for a reason, for a season, and complain about why we're here? We go through these difficult times in life where we have a loved one that dies, or we're begging for bread, we don't have fish to fix, to eat, our family is starving and we're not satisfied, why do we think it has to be all about us? God doesn't intend for us to stay in this season forever. God didn't expect the Israelites to stay in the desert and wilderness forever. 40 years is a long time. Some of us may have been walking through the desert in our season for 20 years. But it doesn't mean that God is done working yet. God met the needs of the Israelites by supplying them with food. And we can learn from this that God will also meet us in limbo as well. We might be waiting for a job, or we might be living from paycheck to paycheck, but God provides for us in the desert and in the promised land. The Israelites may have thought it was a smooth sailing since they left their former lives in Egypt. No longer would they have to be micromanaged by taskmasters, and they had a bright future ahead. But they expected it to happen fast. They didn't realize that sometimes getting to the promised land takes time, and that God may have wanted them to learn some lessons in faith and trusting Him, and that He fights for them when they're surrounded by a great number of enemies on their way to the promised land. Conclusion. During the narratives that we went through tonight, we see a lot of complaining and a lot of troubles in paradise. Why did it take 40 years to get through what was supposed to be an 11-day journey? Even we as Christians of today would have the hardest time believing any of this as well. Faith had to be applied for almost 500 years worth of the life of the Hebrews to get them from some sort of salvation from Egypt. I still have a hard time believing, and I've grown up in church my whole life. One of the toughest challenges for me was that I struggled building my faith, and I was always being taught these accounts of the Bible as stories on felt boards. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. It's no way negative or meant towards the teachers or leadership I was under. It was merely just the thing of the time. That was the big learning thing of the time. I've read the Bible many times, and even up until I moved to Madisonville a couple years back to work Dr. Knight, I had a foundation of faith, and I was always spiritually fed. But my understanding of the Bible was, okay, cool, they're neat stories. I wonder if they've got a couple comic books about this. That was my fault of having immature faith. And as I mentioned earlier, I went to Israel, and I could tell you firsthand that you will definitely read the Bible differently. I wish I could show you the pictures and videos on my phone. I wouldn't have even been speaking. I would have just been showing you pictures, and I could still talk about those for hours. But one of the things I was thankful for being able to travel to Israel was seeing the accounts of the Bible unfolding before my eyes. The city of David and the bricks used to make his palace. Pastor had a message, and I used this picture a couple months ago. You remember that message? So these bricks were the bricks that Nehemiah used to rebuild Jerusalem. This next one. This is the mosaic flooring of King Herod's summer home. His bedroom. Tel Megiddo. Tel means mound. Megiddo is where Armageddon's happening. Different places like that. But with the show of hands, I want to know who knows what this is. Close. It's very close. This is actually called the Ipuwer Papyrus. This dates back to the 19th dynasty of Egypt, 1292 to 1189 BC, currently on display in Norway. The Ipuwer content on the recto, which is the written side that we're looking at, is in the form of a long poem. It is largely a conversation of an Egyptian called Ipuwer who is talking to some. This is what gets me. This is one of the excerpts I read. It was on a scholar thesis. It's of an Egyptian called Ipuwer who was talking to someone called the Lord of All. And according to this scholar's paper. It's called The Pure Papyrus in the Exodus by Anne Habermel. She states, some scholars do not know who this is because the manuscript does not say, at least in the part that we have. This leaves scholars to give their preferred interpretations, and they do not have inhibitions about doing this. The two main choices are that the Lord of all was either the Pharaoh of Egypt, or he was the chief deity, perhaps even the Egyptian creator god. Now, I sincerely disagree with that. To me, that sounds like it's coming from a secular author. But let's take a look at what the Pure Papyrus actually says. A pure papyrus. There was blood everywhere. The river is blood. But in Exodus it says, all the waters that were in the river were turned to blood. Exodus 7:20. Now, the Pure Papyrus is a Egyptian script that line per line compares to the events of Exodus, the plagues. When we read the historical measures of the Bible, there is a part of our humanity that derives from the faith our grannies and granddads tried to instill in us about faith. We've all asked our grandparents when we were young, how do we know that God is real? And they always say, oh, honey, I just know he's real. And that's fine. That's really fine. But it never answered the question. And because of this, we don't fully digest what the Scripture is really telling us. We see the Scripture as stories and not history. If we keep reading through the Bible, complaining never got anybody anywhere. That was the whole purpose of this message. We give the devil an inch worth of complaining when he'll end up turning it into a mile. Or why would we give him a stick to beat us with? We all come knowing that there is a divine purpose for each of us within the kingdom of God. We all have gifts and talents that move the church forward. But if we continue to complain about how the decorations look in the church, or the songs sung on Sunday weren't from the redback, or the pastor wore the wrong shade of blue on his shoestrings and didn't match his hair, what difference does it make? We're allowing our complaints to override the methods of God. Now, I want you to think about this. How much time during the last couple of days, we'll say 4, 5, 6, 7 days, have you spent complaining about your job, your money, your car, your spouse, whatever? You know complaining started in the garden, right? God came down looking for Adam and said, hey, Adam, where are you? And Adam said, you know, that wife you gave me, she's a little sketchy. God said, seriously, Adam, you dropped the ball and you're going to blame it on Eve? He's complaining about his wife. And in chapter 2, he's loving it up. Loves his wife. Oh, you such, whatever. I might do that to Haley. It might make me puke. I'll delete this out. She doesn't have any clothes on. And he's like, woo! He saw that what God gave him was good. And he likes it. But in chapter 3, he fails and complains about God's gift to him. How much time this week has your mouth saturated the atmosphere with complaints? I have a feeling that if your life was anything like mine, your mouth would move faster than you knew you were complaining. I have so much stuff to do this week, and I feel like there's not enough week to do it. So how do we stop complaining? God didn't bring us out of all he did for us to die in our religion. We have to do the following. 1, realize that complaining is dangerous. We know the enemy of our souls doesn't want us to fulfill God's intended purpose for our lives. If he can't derail me or you because of lust or immorality in our private lives, then the devil will seek a different bait for his trap. And that's just an example. It doesn't have to be immorality or lust. For many of us, that snare is the temptation of gripe, grumble, and complain against God. 1 Corinthians 9:24 through 10 and 13. Number 2, remember, God knows what he's doing. Joseph puts me under the pile. He was thrown into a pit by his brothers, sold by them into slavery, unjustly accused of fooling around with Potiphar's wife, thrown into prison, forgotten by a friend he had helped, and yet Scripture doesn't record a single complaint. He could have become bitter against his brothers or smashed his fist against the prison walls and complained that his circumstances were unjust, but he didn't. What was the secret of his complaint-free life? The answer is in Genesis 45, 5 through 8, where we find Joseph, now the governor of Egypt, it's full circle, addressing his servant brothers, saying, "And now do not be grieved or angry with yourselves, because God has sent me before you to preserve life." 3 times in 4 verses, Joseph said, "God sent me here." Talk about a perspective that comes as a result of an uncommon faith in an omnipotent God. Joseph grasped the truth that God is in control and that he knows what he is doing. Number 3, put away past complaints that may become bitterness. A grudge is an aging complaint still being held against another person. The longer you carry a complaint against another, the greater the probability will become a grudge too heavy to handle. Complaining can give birth to resentment. Be hospitable to one another without complaint. 1 Peter 4:9. If you have a complaint against your brother, go to him in private and clear the slate. And number 4, keep on giving thanks for all things. 1 Thessalonians 5:18. This is not just some power of positive thinking. No, I will continue to give thanks because I see God as the sovereign ruler of the universe, and through him working in my life and through all of my circumstances. I'm finished. And I'm on time. Won't he do it? So, I know I've had questions last time. Did anybody have any questions on this one? I thought it would. No. The pictures that I saw, or that I showed, those were, of course, of Israel. That's how I knew those were certain aspects. Now, as far as the plagues and stuff go, I did about a year and a half ago. No, it was around this time last year. I did a podcast, and I had 20 pages of notes, and it was all on the breakdown of the plagues and how it affected not only Pharaoh, how it affected Moses, the Hebrews, the Israelites, but how it affected the gods and the deities that Egypt had worshipped. And so a lot of that, I studied extensively for that. And so the purpose for that podcast was to lead into Passover that we're going to have in a couple weeks, leading into Easter. And so it was just a Passover, kind of message. But that's how I learned a lot of this, was through that. But yeah, it definitely always helps to go to Israel and see that firsthand. The scrolls? Are you talking about the pure papyrus? This is actually, I think it was found in Norway. No, I take that back. It was found in Egypt. Some random Egyptian dude had sold it to some guy in Norway, and that Norwegian guy sold it to the museum. And so that's where that's at. It's kind of like the Dead Sea Scroll thing. I think some random camel herder had found the cave that the Dead Sea Scrolls were in. And I actually got to meet the grandson of the guy who had found the Dead Sea Scrolls. He has a shop in Bethlehem where they carve wood from Bethlehem trees and make manger scenes out of them, or depictions of like the first temple and stuff like that. They sell them for like $80,000. But they had a picture of the guy holding up the Dead Sea Scrolls in their shop, and it was pretty neat. Let me check. I think this may be older than Dead Sea Scrolls. For the Dead Sea Scrolls? Oh, for this? Let me check real quick. Yeah. Thank God for technology, right? It looks like about the 14th century, carbon dated to being 408 to 203 BCE for the Dead Sea Scrolls. So this tends to be a lot older. Yeah, no problem. Do you have any questions? No? All right. Well, it was a pleasure, and always like, biblical history, so this kind of stuff always intrigues me. So if you haven't given tonight, offering baskets right here. Don't forget what we have coming up this weekend, and we'll pray real quick. Brother Hood, do you want to lead us in prayer tonight?